It was an operation that would, if successful, win the war within 6 months of D-Day. The brainchild of General Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, it would put British troops at the spearhead of the assault into Nazi Germany.
It's fraught with risk, but the potential gains are so great that it is considered worth a punt.
What no one predicted was that the men of the British 1st Airborne Division would drop into some of the most intense fighting that any British troops saw for the whole of the war, and the last battle that most of them would fight.
The whole of the Market Garden operation is about real hand-to-hand fighting. This is a real bloodbath.
In the late summer of 1944, victory over Hitler's Germany was inevitable. In the east, a Soviet invasion of unimaginable scale had shredded whole groups of armies and brought Soviet troops almost to the borders of Germany itself. In the west, following the ferocious battle for Normandy that began with D-Day, Paris had been liberated and German units had been scrambling to retreat. It seemed that Hitler's Wehrmacht might be on the verge of total collapse.
The end of the Normandy campaign is only kind of sort of 3 weeks before. And they've had this incredible surge, which is sort of finally ended on the 6th of September. So from the kind of, the last week of August through to the 6th of September, they've just gone absolutely unbelievable distances. The Germans seem to be on the run, they seem to be completely disorganised. So Montgomery, who is 21st Army Group commander and has just relinquished overall command of the ground forces to Eisenhower, he thinks that the drive through the north is the best chance they have. That is the easiest route to winning the war in Germany. And so there is some political motivations for A, getting on with the war quickly, that's the number one, but B, that Britain plays a key part in that. And there is also, and I think it's fair to say, Montgomery's ego, which is that he quite fancies being the kind of great victor that kind of relieves Berlin and all the rest of it.
Codenamed Market Garden, it was a two-pronged operation. Market, an airborne assault to seize key bridges, and Garden, a ground attack moving up through the path created by the airborne element. It would begin with the biggest airborne operation in history. Almost 35,000 British and Allied troops being dropped into Nazi-occupied territory.
I think in Montgomery's mind, Market Garden would have been a fairly quick and simple capture of the bridges in Nijmegen and then in Arnhem, and that's the real focus, of course, of Market Garden.
So the idea is to have this sort of carpet of airborne troops securing this series of bridges. I think there's something like 11 or 12 bridges that they've got to get across. And then you've got 30 corps, supported by 2 other corps either side of them, who are then going to steam up and support the airborne troops and get across all these bridges and force their way into northern Germany. It's fraught with risk, but the potential gains are so great that it is considered worth a punt.
On Sunday, the 17th of September, the massive airlift began. Ron Johnson was one of the glider pilots involved in the operation.
As we passed over the North Sea, as far as we could see, we were in 2 lanes, tugs and gliders, and we were told afterwards, it stretched for about 100 miles. And it was one of the most amazing sights I've ever seen. These tugs and gliders right into the far distant, and it really was quite a sight.
From Allied lines in the south, up a narrow corridor through places like Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and ending at Arnhem, British, American and Allied airborne troops landed. The target of the landings at Arnhem was obviously the big bridge across the River Rhine. And yet Allied planners decided to drop all the airborne forces out here on this heath. No river in sight. The idea had been that dropping the troops over Arnhem itself might expose the aircraft to the anti-aircraft guns in the city and lead to disorganisation as troops fell in busy urban streets. Out here, you could form up and march into town as a cohesive unit. It's a fine idea. The trouble is, that bridge is 8 miles away. I'm meeting with battlefield historian Paul Reed, who's able to tell me more about the Battle of Arnhem and the airborne troops who fought here. Paul, what was it like when that first wave landed just up the road here?
The initial landings at Arnhem went very well because they were so far from the objective. I suspect any German officer probably thought we'd never land there. So there was no one on the ground to stop us, and they went in quite successfully. The Pathfinders did their job, the gliders came in, the men got out and they began their march forward.
As the British paratroopers marched along these streets towards the centre of Arnhem, the most unexpected obstacle they faced was the crowds of enthusiastic Dutch people who flooded out of homes and offices to greet their liberators. This was the moment of national salvation. There was a festival atmosphere. It wouldn't last. Initial Allied intelligence calculated that they would face reservists who would put up limited opposition. But then reports from Dutch resistance cells brought bad news, and it was backed up by aerial reconnaissance.
Well, you've got 2 SS Corps here, or SS2 Corps I should say, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, and you know, they've been really badly hammered. These divisions have been in Normandy. And they've been absolutely hammered. They're being slightly sort of reconstituted. This is the moment where the Germans are sort of regaining their balance. The planners absolutely know this, but they just thought, so what? You know, we can deal with it. There was not a failure of intelligence gathering, there was a failure of intelligence processing.
Frank Ashley was another glider pilot who fought at Arnhem.
I was sent on a patrol with 2 other glider pilots, Ray Osborne and Wade Watson, and a Captain O'Malley in the South Staffs. And our orders were, find the Germans, come back and tell us where they are and how strong they are. We got about half a mile or thereabouts, and everywhere we looked were German soldiers. And they'd seen us.
The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Parachute Regiment got held up by German blocking detachments, but the 2nd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to come right along here, right along the north bank of the river, and get in towards the middle of town. They found that railway bridge had been blown up by the Germans, but the road bridge beyond it was intact, and they managed to occupy the northern end. They had seized the primary objective of Market Garden. Now, just 800 men out of a whole force, the 1st British Airborne Division of 10,000, was in possession of that bridge, and they had to hold it. But there was a big problem. The Allied Air Forces simply didn't have enough aircraft to transport the whole of the British 1st Airborne Division in one go. The plan was to drop them over 3 days, which meant that on the first day they achieved surprise, but after that the Germans knew where the landing zone was. They'd be able to counterattack it, they'd be able to contest it. This meant that subsequent waves of airborne troops were landing onto a battlefield. They were being shot at as they came down their parachutes. They'd been dropped into an inferno. On the morning of day 2, give me the situation on this battlefield.
Well, one group had got to the bridge, the 2nd lift was coming in, 4th Parachute Brigade was coming in, so more men were arriving to push forward to get into Arnhem. So these men find themselves arriving, going straight into action, and then all hell is let loose. And 4th Parachute Brigade, for example, within 24 hours was down to just a handful of guys.
So what happens to the paras is they face an initial small amount of resistance, which they can overwhelm and overmatch. But then if they're going to cross the bridge and get to the other side, which is what it's all about, it's getting this crossing of the Rhine, then you've got a real issue with that, because you don't have the depth to be able to put enough people across. So they had to dig in, they had to use a number of houses around the end of the bridge, fortify them, and they had to keep the Germans back, who kept on, of course, doing what the Germans were really good at, and that's counterattacking.
Now they faced an assault by German armour and artillery, which systematically smashed the buildings surrounding them. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe flew low passes, strafing them, and they were running low on medical supplies and ammunition. It was some of the fiercest fighting that any British unit saw during the Second World War. And after holding the bridge for 4 days, the situation facing Frost and his men was truly desperate. He managed to make communication with Divisional HQ on the radios, and they informed him that no further help could be expected. He was on his own. At 13:30, he was badly injured. The Germans were closing the noose. A fire swept through the makeshift hospital. It was decided to organise a truce so the wounded could be surrendered into German hands, including Frost, to receive some medical attention. That night, the final pockets of British resistance here at the bridge were stamped out. The last radio message broadcast said, "Out of ammunition, God save the King." Once Frost is overrun on the north end of Arnhem Bridge, what is there left to fight for? Because the bridge is back in German hands.
It is, but I think a decision by this stage had already been made that we can't get to them. Hopefully they'll hold out, but we need to make sure that we hold out as well, because somewhere along the line, 30 Corps, the ground troops, are going to meet up with us, we hope. So a decision is made to pull back into the urban environment of Oosterbeek. And if they can defend the Oosterbeek perimeter in these narrow streets, then they can hold on there until the cavalry arrive, until the 30 Corps get there.
The fighting at Oosterbeek became so ferocious that the British nicknamed it the Devil's Cauldron. That was not just street to street or house to house fighting, but room to room, with troops from both sides mouse-holing their way through walls, attacking and counter-attacking. Ron Johnson remembers one incident at the hotel.
I was standing near the end trench of my section, when suddenly a half-track vehicle came right up close. And standing up was the commander of this half-track vehicle. And without thinking too much about it, I got my revolver and fired at the man. And rather incredibly, I shot him and killed him.
Is there any chance that that enclave here on the north bank of the Rhine, could that have held out indefinitely, or were they condemned men?
There's no way they could have held out indefinitely, because the resupply was pretty good, but it was being dropped in the wrong place. And what they needed in terms of equipment, food, material, ammunition and so on was just not arriving. They were running out of this stuff. And gradually the Germans were getting nearer and nearer, pushing them back street by street, house by house. Initially the Germans had been cocky, but they'd learnt from those lessons, and there was more armour coming in. I mean, they even had King Tigers here at the end of the Oosterbeek battle, but held back by the artillery of 30 Corps.
Despite the difficulties at Arnhem, further south, Operation Market Garden was almost on schedule. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had, despite some bitter fighting, captured their objectives, and 30 Corps had been able to steam up the road now dubbed Hell's Highway. But for the 1st Airborne at Arnhem and Oosterbeek, this was of little comfort. Running low on supplies, the men surrounded on the north bank of the Rhine would either have to retreat or surrender. Glider pilot Frank Ashley held out in an isolated position for days.
And without a trace of an accent. So, gentlemen, we know you're there. You have 5 minutes to come down with your hands up. We have men posted on the staircase above you and below you and here in the church. There is no way out. We decided there's no sense whatever in throwing your life away. So we used the 5 minutes to disable our weapons by breaking off the firing pins so they were so much junk. And we surrendered. I had a few words of German, very few, and they were schoolboy. But I said, nicht essen 4 Tage, which is not eaten 4 days.
On the evening of the 25th of September, under heavy rain, the evacuation took place. The men muffled their weapons, their boots, to make sure that no sound would alert the Germans. And they made their way down to the riverbank here. Some of them swam, others took boats across to the south bank. Around 2,000 men managed to get out, but they left behind them thousands of their comrades here on the North Bank, both wounded and those who'd been unable to retreat. The Battle of Arnhem was over. The British 1st Airborne Division held out at Arnhem for 9 days, but the failure to capture the bridge over the Rhine signalled the end of Operation Market Garden. The 1st Airborne would never recover from its losses. 75% were killed, wounded or missing after the battle. Around 7,000 men lost. The people of Arnhem suffered terribly. 500 killed in the fighting, and the entire population expelled as the Germans turned the town into a fortified strongpoint, looting the houses and leaving a wasteland. It was not liberated until the last days of the war in 1945.
Arnhem was not a failure, but neither was it a great success. It perhaps could have been better had it been better planned and there'd been more intelligence. I think there's no doubt it was a gamble worth taking, although there were casualties, not just fighting troops, of course, Dutch civilians, but we learned some really important lessons from it, which we're able to apply in March 45 for the varsity operation, the crossing of the Rhine, which I think were really, really useful in terms of using parachutists and using gliders.
There was no back door into Germany. It would take many months more, intense fighting, millions of people killed, wounded and brutalised, before the Third Reich was finally defeated. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.